Practical Anarchy, Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. Part 70. Modern Land Ownership, Reserves, Trusts and Control. Modern land ownership is not simply a matter of landlords and private developers. Across Europe and beyond, states and large charitable bodies like the National Trust in the UK hold vast tracts of land. On paper, this looks progressive, protecting historic houses, landscapes and wildlife from corporate destruction. Excuse me. National parks and nature reserves are similarly framed as gifts to the people. Yet the logic beneath remains one of enclosure and centralised authority. The land is protected, but it is still fenced off, managed from above, and subject to rules that exclude many everyday uses. For anarchists this raises a paradox. These reserves often succeed in preventing the worst forms of ecological devastation: housing sprawl, industrial farming, corporate extraction. Yet at the same time, they reinforce the idea that ordinary people cannot be trusted to steward land collectively. Access is conditional. You may walk, picnic or admire, but you may not live, build, forage or grow without permission. In this sense, the National Trust and state-run reserves echo the historical enclosures of the commons already discussed earlier in the book. The rhetoric has shifted from private profit to public good, but the underlying structure, central authority regulating land use, persists. Case study: the National Trust. The National Trust is the single largest private landowner in the UK, holding 620,000 acres. While it is technically a charity, its governance is top-down, and access to land is heavily managed. For travellers, squatters, or those seeking low-impact housing, trust land is no more accessible than an aristocrat's estate. Its role has even expanded into managing land for rewilding, yet these projects often come without real local consultation or community control. What could be experiments in commons-based stewardship are instead fenced into institutional frameworks. Case study: conservation and exclusion. Globally, similar patterns emerge. National parks in the US displaced indigenous populations when they were first created. Land was saved for wildlife by criminalising the very communities that had sustained those ecosystems for millennia. More recent conservation efforts sometimes repeat this logic, evicting local populations under the banner of ecological protection. In India and parts of Africa, so-called fortress conservation has displaced communities who lived sustainably for generations, replacing them with rangers, fences and tourism concessions. This contradiction highlights a deeper issue. When land is treated as something to be protected from people, rather than stewarded with them, exclusion and resentment follow. Case study: Scotland and the land question. In Scotland, rewilding estates such as Allerdale Wilderness Reserve have sparked controversy. While presented as ecological restoration, critics note that such projects often reproduce feudal patterns of ownership, vast estates in the hands of wealthy individuals or trusts, fenced off from local communities. Campaigns for land reform, including the right to buy for crofting communities, challenge this model by insisting that ecological protection and community empowerment must go hand in hand. Rewilding without local voices risks becoming another form of top-down enclosure dressed in green language. Case study: Indigenous land back. The land back movement among indigenous peoples in North America takes the critique further. Instead of accepting conservation as exclusion, it demands the return of land to indigenous stewardship. This approach is rooted in traditions of collective governance and long-term ecological care. Where land has been returned, stewardship models often blend cultural revival with ecological restoration. The lesson here is clear. Conservation imposed from above can alienate and exclude, while commons-based stewardship empowers communities and protects ecosystems more effectively. Towards a commons approach. The alternative is not to abandon conservation, but to reframe it. Earlier sections showed how resource councils could coordinate use and protection without centralised ownership. Other sections demonstrated how federations allow for cooperation beyond the local level. Applied to land, this would mean rethinking reserves, parks and rewilding schemes as commons, stewarded directly by the communities who live with them, and federated to handle ecological concerns at larger scales. Case study: small-scale commons in practice. Examples already exist, even if fragile. Community woodlands in Wales and Scotland allow local groups to manage forests for firewood, biodiversity and recreation. In Italy, occupied spaces such as Mondeghi Bene Commune in Florence have experimented with collective farming on abandoned estates, with open assemblies deciding how land should be used. These cases may not have the visibility of the National Trust or Yellowstone National Park, but they demonstrate that commons-based land stewardship is possible in the present, not just the future. Land ownership is always political, whether it is the aristocratic estate, the corporate farm, or the public reserve. The key question is the same: who decides and for what purpose? Unless conservation is democratised, it risks reproducing the very inequalities it claims to resist. Anarchist approaches would not abolish conservation, but root it in community, making stewardship a right and responsibility rather than a privilege permitted from above.